The autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of the Grand Hotel Metropole, the bastion of discretion and luxury tucked away in the quieter streets of Mayfair. For 30 years, the Metropole had prided itself on the kind of impeccable service that asked no questions and the sort of clientele who valued privacy above all else. Ambassadors breakfasted there, cabinet ministers held clandestine meetings in its oak-paneled private dining rooms, and society ladies conducted their more delicate affairs behind its soundproof walls. It was precisely this reputation for unshakable propriety that made the events of that grey October morning so particularly shocking. The discovery came at 9:30, when Mrs. Hartwell, the head chambermaid whose 20 years of service had never once been marred by scandal or gossip, used her master key to enter room 312. Mr. Gerald Pemberton, the investigative journalist, whose recent exposé of municipal corruption had sent 2 councillors to prison, had failed to respond to her polite morning knock. What she found defied both explanation and the natural order of things that governed the Metropole's civilized world. Mr. Pemberton lay fully clothed in the marble bathtub of his suite, his evening dress from the previous night's dinner still immaculate despite being thoroughly soaked. The water, drawn to a precise depth of 6 inches, had been allowed to cool to room temperature. His hands were folded peacefully across his chest, and his eyes were closed as though he had simply decided to take an unusual rest. On the bathroom floor beside the tub, a heavy crystal paperweight, one of the hotel's elegant appointments, lay incongruously out of place. Mrs. Hartwell's scream brought Mr. Ashford, the hotel manager, running. Within minutes, the police had been summoned, and by 10 o'clock, Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard stood surveying the peculiar scene with the bewildered expression of a man confronting a puzzle for which his training had provided no adequate preparation. "Most irregular," Morrison muttered, examining the positioning of the body. "No signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, yet clearly not a natural death. Who arranges themselves so precisely in a bathtub while fully dressed?" It was at this moment that a small, precise voice spoke from the doorway. "Ah, but that, mon ami, is precisely the question we must ask ourselves, is it not?" Inspector Morrison turned to find a compact, elegantly dressed gentleman observing the scene with bright, intelligent eyes. Everything about the newcomer spoke of meticulous attention to detail, from his perfectly waxed mustache to his patent leather shoes that gleamed despite the morning's rain. "And you are?" Morrison inquired with the patience of a man accustomed to curious hotel guests. "Hercule Poirot," came the reply, accompanied by a slight bow. "I have the honor to occupy room 315 just down the corridor." The commotion it naturally attracted my attention. Morrison's expression shifted to one of recognition and grudging respect. "Ah, the Belgian detective. Well, Mr. Poirot, this is a police matter, but I suppose there's no harm in your observing." Poirot stepped carefully into the bathroom, his gaze moving methodically over every detail. "The water temperature suggests our poor M. Pemberton has been here for several hours, n'est-ce pas? And yet observe, the positioning is too precise, too theatrical for a man who has simply fallen and drowned. None. This arrangement, it speaks of careful planning." His eyes fixed on the crystal paperweight. "This object, it does not belong on the bathroom floor. It comes from the writing desk in the sitting room. I have the identical piece in my own suite. Someone has brought it here, but why? Weapon, perhaps," Morrison suggested. "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But see how the gentleman's head shows no wound, no bruising. If this paperweight struck him, where is the evidence?" Mr. Ashford, hovering anxiously in the doorway, cleared his throat. "Mr. Pemberton dined in our restaurant last evening. Quite a gathering, actually. Several other guests joined his table. He seemed in excellent spirits, discussing his latest investigation with great enthusiasm." Poirot's head turned sharply. "Ah, his latest investigation, and what was the subject of this work?" "I couldn't say precisely. Ashford replied uncomfortably. But he mentioned something about financial irregularities, connections between certain prominent individuals, and some rather questionable business dealings. Most interesting, Poirot said softly. And these other guests who dined with him, they remain at the hotel? Yes, sir. Lord and Lady Pembroke, Mr. Charles Whitfield, the banker, Miss Victoria Ashworth, and Professor Kellerton with his secretary. They're all staying until the weekend. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the light of intellectual curiosity fully aroused. Then we have here our little circle, Inspector Morrison, a journalist who investigates the secrets of others, found dead in circumstances that suggest careful planning other than impulse. And conveniently, all those who shared his final meal remain within these walls. He moved toward the sitting room, gesturing for Morrison to follow. The solution to this puzzle, it will not be found in the physical evidence alone. Non, we must look deeper, into the psychology of our suspects, into the secrets that Monsieur Pemberton may have uncovered, into the fears that drive people to such desperate measures. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Poirot began his methodical examination of the suite, his little grey cells already working to unravel the carefully constructed mystery that had transformed the respectable Grand Hotel Metropole into the scene of a most peculiar crime. The sitting room of Suite 312 told its own story to those who knew how to read the subtle language of displaced objects and careful arrangements. Poirot moved with the deliberate precision of a man cataloguing evidence, his keen eyes noting details that others might dismiss as insignificant. "Inspector Morrison," he said softly, gesturing toward the mahogany writing desk. "Observe the papers scattered here. They appear careless, yes. But see how the edges align too precisely, the spacing too deliberate. Someone has searched through these documents and attempted to restore their original order, but imperfectly." Morrison leaned closer, his initial skepticism giving way to grudging interest. "You're suggesting someone rifled through Pemberton's work?" "More than suggesting, mon ami. I'm certain of it." Poirot indicated the rest of the suite with a sweep of his hand. Everything else speaks of meticulous habits. The wardrobe arranged with military precision, toiletries organized by height and frequency of use. This man did not scatter his most important documents carelessly. The topmost paper bore a typed heading that made both men pause. "The Bath Street Consortium, a web of influence." Beneath it, Pemberton's handwritten notes covered margins and spaces between typed lines, creating a maze of connections between names, dates, and financial figures. "The Bath Street Consortium," Morrison muttered. "I've heard whispers about questionable investments, but nothing concrete enough for charges." But Monsieur Pemberton, he was not concerned with charges, was he? He sought only the truth, and the truth it can be more dangerous than any legal proceeding. Poirot straightened, brushing an invisible speck from his waistcoat. "Come, Inspector. We must speak with our dinner party companions while their memories remain fresh and their nerves still raw." Mr. Ashford appeared in the doorway, his usual composure strained by the morning's events. "Inspector Morrison, I've arranged the blue drawing room for your interviews. The guests are rather agitated by the circumstances." "Naturally," Poirot observed. "Death disturbs the equilibrium of even the most composed individuals. Tell me, Monsieur Ashford, what was the atmosphere at dinner last evening?" Ashford's expression grew thoughtful. "It began pleasantly enough, sir. Mr. Pemberton was quite animated, discussing his latest investigation with evident enthusiasm. But as the evening progressed, the conversation grew more tense. When he mentioned financial irregularities and connections between respectable institutions and questionable enterprises, several guests became decidedly uncomfortable. "Uncomfortable in what way?" Morrison pressed. Lord Pembroke grew defensive when charitable foundations were discussed. Mr. Whitfield appeared most distressed by questions about banking practices. Miss Ashworth seemed fascinated, asking numerous questions about journalistic ethics, while Professor Kellerton's secretary took extensive notes throughout the meal. Poirot's eyebrows rose, slightly. And after dinner, the party dispersed immediately? No, sir. They retired to the smoking room for brandy. The ladies joined briefly before retiring around 10:30. The gentlemen remained until nearly midnight, though their conversation grew increasingly subdued. The blue drawing room, with its silk-covered walls and crystal chandeliers, provided an appropriately civilized setting for what promised to be revelations of a most uncivilized nature. 5 individuals sat in carefully maintained composure, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, concern, and barely concealed anxiety. Lord Pembroke rose as they entered, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of inherited authority. "Inspector Morrison, this is a terrible business. Gerald was a fine fellow despite his rather aggressive approach to journalism." "Indeed, Lord Pembroke," Morrison replied formally. "We'll need to speak with each of you individually. Mr. Poirot here is assisting with the investigation." Poirot bowed slightly, his keen eyes noting subtle reactions to his introduction. Miss Ashworth's fingers tightened on her teacup. Mr. Whitfield's jaw clenched briefly before relaxing into a practiced smile. The secretary glanced quickly at Professor Kellerton before returning her gaze to folded hands. "If we might begin with you, Lord Pembroke," Morrison continued, "in the smaller salon adjacent." The salon overlooked the rain-slicked street, its coal fire providing warmth against the October chill. Poirot positioned himself with his back to the light, ensuring his subject would be fully illuminated. "This is most irregular, Inspector," Pembroke began, settling into his chair with aristocratic composure. "I'm due at the Foreign Office at 11. Surely this cannot take long." "That depends entirely upon your cooperation, my lord," Poirot said quietly. "Mr. Pemberton is dead. Murdered, we believe, under circumstances that suggest careful planning rather than impulse." Pembroke's cigarette holder slipped fractionally before he recovered. "Murdered? How extraordinary. Though I suppose Gerald made enough enemies with his muckraking." "You knew him well?" Morrison asked. "Well enough. We moved in similar circles, though our approaches to public service differed considerably. He believed in exposing what he called corruption, while I preferred the more traditional methods of quiet influence and diplomatic pressure." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And the Bath Street Consortium, Lord Pembroke, did your diplomatic pressure extend to that particular venture?" The effect was immediate and telling. Pembroke's eyes flickered with something between surprise and calculation before settling into cool wariness. "That name has been bandied about too freely of late. Yes, I invested in it, along with half of London's financial community. It failed. People lost money. Unpleasant, but hardly criminal." "Perhaps not criminal," Poirot agreed. "But for a journalist who lived by uncovering scandals, it might prove most illuminating material, n'est-ce pas?" Pembroke stared at him for a long moment, then gave a dry laugh. "If you're suggesting I had Gerald killed to prevent some embarrassing article, you're wasting your time, Mr. Poirot. I've survived worse attacks in the press than anything that young man could have written." The interview continued, but Poirot had already noted what mattered most: the flash of genuine fear that had crossed Pembroke's features at the mention of the Bath Street Consortium, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. Whatever secrets lay buried in that failed investment, they were worth more than mere embarrassment to protect. As Pembroke departed with assurances that he would remain available, Poirot turned to Morrison with satisfaction. "The first thread, Inspector. Now we must follow where it leads." Mr. Charles Whitfield entered the salon with the measured precision of a man who had built his fortune through calculated risks and meticulous attention to detail. Unlike Lord Pembroke's inherited authority, Whitfield's bearing spoke of battles fought and won in the unforgiving world of commercial banking. His silver-rimmed spectacles caught the firelight as he surveyed the room, and his expensive but understated suit emphasized a frame that had thickened with prosperity and middle age. "Gentlemen," he began, settling into the leather chair with practiced efficiency. "I trust this unfortunate business can be resolved quickly. The markets wait for no man, and I have several pressing matters requiring attention." "Naturally," Poirot replied with deceptive mildness. "Time is indeed precious for a man in your position. Tell us, Monsieur Whitfield, what was your relationship with the deceased?" "Professional acquaintance. Nothing more." Whitfield adjusted his spectacles with nervous precision. "Gerald occasionally sought my expertise regarding financial matters for his articles. I provided general information when appropriate. Nothing confidential, you understand. Yet you dined with him regularly during his stays at the Metropole," Morrison observed, consulting his notes. Whitfield's smile remained fixed, but his fingers drummed against the chair arm. "The hotel encourages guests to socialize. Gerald was an entertaining companion when he wasn't pursuing his more aggressive investigations." "Ah, yes," Poirot interjected softly. "These investigations. Last evening he discussed financial irregularities, connections between respectable institutions and questionable enterprises. The Bath Street Consortium, perhaps?" The effect was immediate and telling. Whitfield's hands, which had been resting casually, clenched briefly before he forced them to relax. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and a faint flush crept up his neck. "That particular venture has been thoroughly examined by appropriate authorities," he said carefully. "No, irregularities were found." "But what exactly was the nature of this consortium?" Morrison pressed. Whitfield glanced between the two men, clearly calculating his response. "Property development, converting derelict buildings into luxury accommodations. The concept was sound, the initial surveys promising. Unfortunately, planning permissions were delayed, then denied entirely. Several key investors withdrew suddenly. The whole enterprise collapsed within 6 months." "And the funds that had already been invested?" Poirot's voice remained conversational, but his eyes were sharp with interest. "Lost, naturally. Such is the nature of speculative ventures." Poirot tilted his head slightly, like a bird examining an interesting specimen. "Yet Monsieur Pemberton believed otherwise, did he not? He suggested that certain funds had been redirected rather than lost." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Whitfield's composure finally cracked, his face flushing then paling as he leaned forward aggressively. Gerald Pemberton was a meddling journalist who understood nothing about complex financial arrangements, he said, his voice rising. "His insinuations were not only false, but potentially libelous. He approached me just last week, demanding access to confidential ledgers, alleging fraudulent transfers before the consortium's collapse. Preposterous threats from a man who specialized in destroying reputations." "And how far would you go to protect your reputation, Monsieur Whitfield?" Poirot asked gently. Whitfield rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You cannot seriously suggest I would resort to murder over a newspaper article." "Not merely an article," Poirot replied, his voice still mild, "but the complete destruction of a carefully constructed career. The exposure of financial improprieties that could result in criminal charges." "This interview is concluded," Whitfield declared, moving toward the door. "If you wish to make accusations, do so through proper legal channels." "One moment," Poirot said calmly. "After the ladies retired last evening, you remained in the smoking room until nearly midnight. What was discussed?" Whitfield paused, his hand on the brass handle. Gerald continued his ridiculous theories about financial conspiracies. The rest of us grew tired of his paranoid fantasies and retired to our rooms. "Directly to your room?" "Of course. Merci, Monsieur Whitfield. We may have further questions." After the banker departed, Morrison turned to Poirot with raised eyebrows. "He's hiding something substantial." "More than something, mon ami," Poirot replied, watching Whitfield's agitated departure through the rain-streaked window. "A man like Monsieur Whitfield does not achieve his position without understanding that reputation is everything. If Monsieur Pemberton possessed evidence of genuine fraud, threatening exposure just 1 week ago, He paused meaningfully. The timing says it creates what you might call a very tight window for desperate action. The fire crackled softly as they prepared for the next interview, both men aware they had glimpsed only the surface of a conspiracy that ran far deeper than a simple hotel murder. Miss Victoria Ashworth entered the salon with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to navigating rooms dominated by men. Yet Poirot's keen eyes detected the subtle tremor in her gloved hands as she settled into the chair recently vacated by Whitfield. At 30, she possessed the sharp intelligence and restless energy of someone determined to carve her own path through London's literary circles. Her auburn hair was styled fashionably, and though her dark dress was appropriate for the circumstances, it could not diminish her striking presence. "Inspector Morrison, Mr. Poirot," she began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of good breeding tempered by professional ambition. "This is all quite dreadful. Poor Gerald, though I must confess, given his methods, perhaps not entirely surprising." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "His methods, mademoiselle?" Gerald pursued stories with the tenacity of a terrier, never considering the consequences for those he exposed. She replied, removing her gloves with practiced elegance. "I'm a journalist myself, or trying to be. I write features for the Chronicle, society profiles, the occasional theatre review. I'd very much like to do the sort of investigative work Gerald specialized in, but it's not considered suitable for a woman, you understand." "Ah, so Monsieur Pemberton was perhaps a mentor to you," Poirot observed. Miss Ashworth's expression grew complex, mixing admiration with frustration. A reluctant one. "He thought I was naive. Told me just last night that chasing the truth ruins one's illusions, and I had too many to spare. Yet he was fascinating to watch work. At dinner, he wasn't making idle conversation about his investigations. He was testing reactions like a scientist conducting experiments." "You observed this closely," Morrison noted. "It's my profession to notice things, Inspector. When Gerald mentioned financial irregularities and questionable business connections, I watched every face at that table. Lord Pembroke grew defensive about charitable foundations. Mr. Whitfield became genuinely angry when banking practices were questioned. Professor Kellerton seemed academically fascinated, while his secretary wrote faster whenever Gerald spoke specific names." "And the Bath Street Consortium?" Poirot asked gently. "What was your observation of the reactions to that particular subject?" The effect was immediate and telling. Miss Ashworth's composure flickered, her fingers tightening on her reticule before she forced them to relax. Her eyes darted briefly to the window before returning to meet Poirot's steady gaze. "That was the nerve he prodded most persistently," she said carefully. "Gerald hinted that what happened there was more than simple business failure, that money had been systematically diverted through friendly institutions before the collapse. When Mr. Whitfield raised his voice in protest, Gerald's eyes absolutely lit up. Like a dog following a scent, that's how he looked." "You seem well informed about Monsieur Pemberton's theories," Morrison observed. "We dine together whenever we happen to be at the Metropole simultaneously. Gerald traveled extensively for his work. This visit, he'd been here 3 days, and I could tell something had him particularly excited. He kept watching people throughout the dining room, not just our table companions. Halfway through the fish course, he suddenly stopped talking and stared toward the entrance. When I asked what was wrong, he laughed and said, 'Nothing, only shadows and the ghosts of old stories.' But he never relaxed again afterward." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Did he confide the specific nature of his current investigation?" Miss Ashworth hesitated, and in that pause, Poirot glimpsed something that troubled her conscience. He'd been receiving threatening letters over the past month, anonymous warnings to abandon his investigation of the Consortium. Gerald laughed them off, said they proved he was close to the truth. One specifically mentioned his hotel stays, suggesting he wasn't as safe as he believed. "He showed you these letters?" Morrison pressed. "No, but Gerald was meticulous about documentation, if anyone could find them." She trailed off, then continued more firmly. I warned him repeatedly that his aggressive tactics would eventually provoke someone beyond reason. He was playing with fire, and I feared exactly what has now happened. After dinner last evening, you retired with Lady Pembroke around 10:30. Yes, we went upstairs together. I'm in room 308, just down the corridor from Gerald's suite. We chatted briefly before I retired to my room. And you heard nothing unusual during the night? Nothing at all. The Metropole is usually very quiet, and I'm typically a light sleeper. As Miss Ashworth prepared to leave, Poirot asked quietly, "Mademoiselle, you speak of fearing for Monsieur Pemberton's safety, yet you also mention his methods being unsuitable. Did you perhaps fear for others as well, those who might be hurt by his revelations?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Miss Ashworth's face flushed, then paled before she recovered her composure with visible effort. Truth can be a dangerous weapon, Mr. Poirot. Gerald wielded it without considering the innocent who might be caught in the crossfire. After she departed, Morrison turned to Poirot with raised eyebrows. "She's hiding something substantial." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, watching her retreating figure through the rain-streaked window. "The question, mon ami, is whether she hides it to protect herself, or someone else entirely." Professor Alistair Kellerton entered the salon with the distracted air of a man whose thoughts habitually dwelt in centuries past rather than the immediate present. His tall, angular frame was draped in a well-worn tweed jacket that bore the faint chalk dust of countless lectures, and his steel-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on a prominent nose. Behind him followed his secretary, Miss Eleanor Vance, a woman of perhaps 40 whose unremarkable appearance and efficient manner seemed deliberately cultivated to render her invisible in academic circles. "Professor Kellerton, Miss Vance," Morrison began, gesturing toward the chairs arranged before the dying fire. "We understand you both dined with Mr. Pemberton last evening." Kellerton settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone nursing old war injuries. "Indeed, a most stimulating evening, though it ended rather more tensely than I would have preferred. Gerald was pursuing some theory about financial malfeasance. Fascinating from a historical perspective, you understand. I lecture on economic history at Cambridge, and Gerald occasionally sought my expertise on historical precedents for modern scandals." "You knew him well?" Poirot inquired, noting how Miss Vance positioned herself slightly behind the professor, her leather notebook already open. "We'd met several times over the years. This visit was different, however. Gerald specifically requested my consultation. He telephoned last week, asking if I might spare a few days to examine what he called a modern echo of the South Sea bubble. He'd uncovered what he believed was a deliberate scheme to defraud investors, using the Bath Street Consortium as a front for more complex manipulations." Miss Vance cleared her throat softly. The professor identified several historical parallels where legitimate investment opportunities masked systematic theft. The pattern typically involves initial genuine investments to establish credibility, followed by gradual redirection of funds through intermediary institutions before the inevitable collapse. "Most illuminating," Poirot observed, and Monsieur Pemberton's reaction to this analysis. Professor Kellerton's expression grew troubled. He became quite agitated, actually. Said it confirmed his worst suspicions about certain individuals involved in the consortium. He'd identified what he called the puppet master, someone orchestrating the entire scheme while maintaining apparent respectability. "Did he name this individual?" Morrison pressed. "No, but he implied it was someone present at our dinner table," Kellerton replied, glancing at Miss Vance, who nodded encouragingly. "Gerald said he'd gathered enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy, but he needed one final piece. Documentary proof of the fund transfers he suspected." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "And where did he hope to obtain this proof?" Miss Vance spoke quietly, consulting her notes. He mentioned having arranged a meeting for later that evening. Someone had agreed to provide the documents he needed, though he seemed nervous about the arrangement. He kept checking his watch during the later courses, said he had an appointment at 11:30 after the others had retired. "Yet you gentlemen remained in the smoking room until nearly midnight," Poirot observed. "Yes, but Gerald left us around 11:15, Professor Kellerton confirmed. Said he had correspondence to attend to, but his manner was distinctly agitated. We continued our discussion, fascinating parallels to current events, really. Mr. Whitfield excused himself perhaps 20 minutes after Gerald left, claiming early morning meetings. Lord Pembroke remained until we all retired together," Miss Vance added. "During dinner, Mr. Pemberton drew connections between the Consortium and a charitable trust, the St. Jude's Benevolent Fund. He alleged it was being used to launder illicit profits, controlled by a small, exclusive board with highly opaque investments. He believed the fund had secretly acquired the Consortium's properties at substantial discounts before selling them for massive profits." Morrison leaned forward with growing excitement. "St. Jude's Benevolent Fund. Lord Pembroke is a trustee, isn't he? That explains his defensive reaction about charitable foundations. Mr. Pemberton was particularly interested in a specific land deed transfer," Miss Vance continued, "signed just weeks before the Consortium's bankruptcy announcement. He called it the linchpin, said it would be hidden in plain sight." "This is it," Morrison declared, rising decisively. "Lord Pembroke clearly had motive to silence Pemberton before he exposed the charity. We need to investigate this fund immediately." Poirot, however, remained seated, a faint frown creasing his brow. "Indeed, Inspector, a most compelling narrative. And yet—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the chairs where their suspects had sat. "The details, they fit together a little too neatly, do they not? Like pieces of a puzzle cut specifically to form a particular picture." His eyes lingered on Miss Vance's notebook, then flickered to Professor Kellerton, who was now sketching elaborate diagrams on his own pad, seemingly oblivious to the dramatic implications of his secretary's testimony. "One must always be wary, mon ami, of the obvious solution," Poirot continued quietly, "for the truth, it has a habit of hiding in the most unexpected corners." The first false lead had been laid, and Morrison seemed ready to follow it. But Poirot's little grey cells already detected the faint scent of misdirection hanging in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Lady Margaret Pembroke entered the salon with the measured grace of someone accustomed to navigating delicate social situations, yet her usual composure showed subtle cracks beneath the morning strain. At 55, she retained the refined beauty that had made her one of London's most celebrated hostesses, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace, a gesture Poirot noted with particular interest. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of aristocratic breeding, "this entire situation is quite beyond comprehension. Poor Gerald was such a vital man, so passionate about his work. To think that someone could have—" She paused, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. "Indeed, Lady Pembroke," Poirot said gently. "Such a tragedy touches us all. You knew Monsieur Pemberton well." "Well enough. He was a frequent guest here at the Metropole, and we often found ourselves dining together when our visits coincided. Despite his rather aggressive professional methods, he was charming company when he wasn't pursuing one of his investigations." Morrison consulted his notes. "You retired early last evening, around 10:30 with Miss Ashworth?" "Yes. We ladies left the gentlemen to their cigars and brandy. Gerald seemed particularly animated about some discovery he'd made. He kept hinting at revelations that would shake the foundations of respectable society, as he put it. Quite dramatic, really." Poirot tilted his head with interest. "He spoke specifically of these revelations." Lady Pembroke's composure flickered momentarily. "He mentioned the Bath Street Consortium repeatedly, that failed property venture. Gerald seemed convinced it was more than simple business misfortune. He spoke of systematic fraud, of respectable institutions being used to hide criminal activity. And your husband's reaction to these accusations?" Charles grew increasingly defensive as the evening progressed. she admitted reluctantly. Gerald's implications about charitable foundations were particularly distressing. My husband has devoted years to philanthropic work. The suggestion that such organizations could be corrupted was deeply offensive to him. The St. Jude's Benevolent Fund specifically, Morrison pressed. Lady Pembroke's hands stilled on her handkerchief. Among others, Gerald seemed to believe that charitable trusts were being manipulated to launder illicit profits. When Charles protested that such accusations were not only unfounded but potentially libelous, Gerald laughed and said the truth would emerge regardless of social sensitivities. "A most uncomfortable situation," Poirot observed. "Yet you continue to dine together. One doesn't simply abandon dinner companions over professional disagreements, Mr. Poirot. Though I confess, by the time we ladies retired, the atmosphere had grown quite strained. After you retired to your room, did you hear anything unusual? Voices? Movement in the corridor?" Lady Pembroke hesitated, and in that pause, Poirot glimpsed something that troubled her deeply. Well, yes, actually. Around 11:30, I heard voices in the corridor. Gerald's voice, certainly, and someone else. Though I couldn't identify whom, they seemed to be entering his suite." Morrison leaned forward eagerly. "Could you determine if it was a man or woman?" "A man, I believe, though they spoke very quietly. I heard Gerald say something about the documents you promised, and the other voice mentioning discretion being paramount. Then the door closed, and I heard nothing more." "You didn't think to investigate?" Poirot asked gently. "Certainly not. It wasn't my place to intrude on Gerald's private business, whatever its nature." "Yet you remained awake?" Lady Pembroke's cheeks flushed slightly. I was concerned about Charles. He'd been so upset by Gerald's accusations. I waited until he returned from the smoking room, which wasn't until nearly midnight. He was quite agitated, pacing about our suite, muttering about irresponsible journalism and reputation destroyed by innuendo. Your husband seemed genuinely distressed? Extremely so. He kept saying Gerald had gone too far this time, that some accusations couldn't be ignored or dismissed. He was still awake when I finally fell asleep around 1 o'clock. As Lady Pembroke prepared to leave, Morrison turned to her with sudden inspiration. "One final question. Does your husband keep administrative access to the St. Jude's Fund offices? Could he have obtained documents that might prove or disprove Pemberton's allegations?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Lady Pembroke went completely pale, her handkerchief fluttering to the floor as her hands flew to her throat. That is, Charles handles many administrative duties for the fund, but surely you cannot suggest—" She rose unsteadily, her composure finally cracking entirely. "This interview is concluded. If you wish to make accusations against my husband, you must do so through proper legal channels." After she departed, Morrison turned to Poirot with satisfaction. "There's our confirmation. Lord Pembroke had access to the very documents Pemberton needed, motive to prevent their exposure, and opportunity to meet with him privately. The case is practically solved." But Poirot remained seated, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Perhaps, mon ami. And yet, Lady Pembroke's testimony, it provides exactly what we need to suspect her husband, does it not? Almost too perfectly, one might say." "What do you mean?" "A wife who happens to overhear the crucial conversation, who remembers precisely the right details to implicate her husband's access to documents, who reveals his agitated state at exactly the moment we need such evidence." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Either Lady Pembroke is the most observant and forthright witness in London, or she is directing our attention very deliberately toward her husband while concealing something far more significant." The first false lead had been carefully laid, and Morrison seemed ready to follow it. But Poirot's little grey cells detected the faint scent of misdirection hanging in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Morrison's satisfaction with the case, against Lord Pembroke proved as fragile as morning frost beneath the sun of further investigation. Within an hour of Lady Pembroke's departure, a telephone call from Scotland Yard delivered information that shattered the inspector's carefully constructed theory with devastating efficiency. "Impossible," Morrison muttered, replacing the receiver with the deliberate care of a man whose certainties had just crumbled. Lord Pembroke was at the Foreign Office from 10 o'clock last evening until past 2 this morning. Emergency cabinet session regarding the Indian situation. The Prime Minister himself confirms it, along with a dozen other witnesses. Poirot, who had been examining the hotel's guest register with particular attention, looked up without surprise. But this confirms what the little grey cells have been whispering, Inspector. Someone has been most careful to direct our suspicions toward his lordship. But Lady Pembroke specifically heard voices, saw her husband's agitated state when he returned. Did she? Poirot interrupted gently. Or did she provide us with precisely the testimony needed to establish suspicion while appearing to support her husband's innocence? Consider the psychology, mon ami. A loyal wife would naturally mention her husband's distress over the accusations. Yet this same testimony conveniently establishes his access to crucial documents and places him in an agitated state after the critical time. Morrison began pacing the small salon, his earlier confidence replaced by frustrated bewilderment. Then who did Pemberton meet? Who brought him those documents? Perhaps, Poirot said quietly. No one brought him documents at all. Perhaps Monsieur Pemberton was lured to his death by the promise of evidence that never existed. The implications hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. If the meeting was a deception, then the murderer had used Pemberton's own investigative passion against him, drawing him into a trap baited with the very proof he desperately sought. A discreet knock interrupted their discussion. Mr. Ashford appeared, his usual composure strained by the morning's revelations. "Gentlemen, I've completed the inquiry you requested regarding room service last evening. The records show an order placed at 11:15 for a pot of coffee and 2 cups to be delivered to room 312. "Ordered by whom?" Morrison asked eagerly. "The curious thing is, sir, the order came from the house telephone in the lobby. No name was given, simply the room number and request. Our porter delivered it at 11:25, and Mr. Pemberton answered the door himself. The porter noticed nothing unusual, though he mentioned that Mr. Pemberton seemed somewhat nervous, checking his watch repeatedly." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. 2 cups, you say? And the porter saw no one else in the suite? "No, sir, though he didn't enter the sitting room. Mr. Pemberton took the tray at the door." After Ashford departed, Poirot moved to the window, his gaze following the rain-streaked patterns on the glass, as though seeking answers in their intricate designs. "The coffee service tells us much, Inspector. Someone wished to establish the appearance of a meeting. 2 cups suggest a guest was expected. Yet if the guest never arrived, or arrived after the coffee was delivered, the murderer could have been someone already in the hotel," Morrison finished. "Someone who knew Pemberton's habits, his investigation, his desperate need for proof." "Precisely. And someone with access to poison, with knowledge of his movements, with the ability to arrange a meeting without arousing suspicion." Poirot turned from the window, his expression grave. "We have been looking at this crime as though it were committed by an outsider seeking to silence Monsieur Pemberton. But what if the murderer was someone he trusted? Someone whose presence in his suite would seem natural, even welcome?" Morrison consulted his notes with growing unease. Miss Ashworth mentioned that Pemberton was watching people throughout the dining room, not just their table companions. She said he suddenly stopped talking and stared toward the entrance, as though he'd seen something significant. Or someone. Poirot corrected. Someone whose presence changed his entire demeanor for the remainder of the evening. Someone who represented either great hope or great danger, perhaps both. The detective moved toward the door, his manner suggesting sudden decision. "Come, Inspector. We must speak again with our guests, but this time with different questions. The first false lead has been exposed, but the true trail grows clearer. Our murderer is clever, methodical, and possessed of intimate knowledge of Monsieur Pemberton's investigation. They have played us expertly thus far, but every performance, no matter how skillful, eventually reveals the actor beneath the mask. As they prepared to leave the salon, Poirot paused, his hand on the brass doorknob. "Remember, mon ami, we seek not just a killer, but an artist of deception. Someone who has orchestrated not merely a murder, but an entire symphony of misdirection. The question now becomes, which of our suspects possesses both the motive and the psychological sophistication to compose such an elaborate performance?" The psychological game was about to begin in earnest, and Poirot's little grey cells hummed with anticipation. The revelation of Lord Pembroke's ironclad alibi had accomplished more than merely eliminating a suspect. It had exposed the careful architecture of deception that surrounded Gerald Pemberton's death. Poirot stood in the doorway of room 312, his keen eyes surveying the scene with renewed understanding. The initial shock of discovery had given way to methodical analysis, and what he saw now was not merely a crime scene, but a carefully composed statement. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I wish to examine the room once more, alone. The physical evidence, it has been speaking to us all along, but we have not been listening with the proper ears." Morrison nodded, recognizing the signs of Poirot's deepest concentration. "I'll keep the others occupied in the lounge. Take all the time you need. Alone in the suite?" Poirot moved with deliberate precision through each room, his gaze cataloguing details that had seemed insignificant during the morning's initial investigation. The sitting room spoke of meticulous habits, every object in its proper place save for the deliberately disarranged papers on the writing desk. The bedroom revealed a man of rigid routine, clothes folded with military precision, personal effects organized by frequency of use. But it was the bathroom that held the key to understanding their killer's psychology. Poirot knelt beside the marble bathtub, studying the precise waterline where 6 inches of liquid had been measured with mathematical accuracy. The crystal paperweight lay where it had been found, seemingly out of place, yet positioned with deliberate care. "Not a weapon," he murmured, lifting the elegant piece and turning it in his gloved hands. "But a signature. A calling card left by someone who values intellectual precision above all else." The arrangement of Pemberton's body, fully clothed, hands folded peacefully, eyes closed, struck him now as profoundly theatrical. This was not the work of someone driven by passion or panic, but of a mind that imposed order even in the act of murder. The killer had not simply eliminated an inconvenient obstacle. They had crafted a symbolic statement, a final imposition of their own meticulous nature upon Gerald Pemberton's chaotic existence. Poirot rose, his understanding crystallizing. "The staging tells us everything about our murderers' psychology. They see the world as a series of problems to be solved with academic precision. They cannot resist leaving their intellectual signature, even at the risk of providing clues." 20 minutes later, he found Miss Ashworth in the hotel's morning room, ostensibly reading a newspaper but clearly waiting for his return. Her composure had improved since their earlier interview, but Poirot detected the subtle tension in her posture that suggested carefully maintained control. "Miss Ashworth," he began, settling into the chair across from her, "I've been reflecting upon your earlier testimony. You mentioned that Monsieur Pemberton's demeanor changed dramatically during dinner, that he suddenly grew pale and excited when looking toward the dining room entrance." She set down her newspaper with deliberate care. "Yes, during the fish course, his entire manner shifted from animated discussion to something approaching shock. You said he laughed afterward in that particular way he had when something both frightened and excited him." "Exactly. He told me later that one of his ghosts had walked into the light. I assumed he meant someone from a previous investigation, someone he hadn't expected to encounter here at the Metropole." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to an intimate tone. "But you did not see who had entered the dining room at that moment?" Miss Ashworth hesitated, and in that pause, Poirot glimpsed the struggle between truth and loyalty that had been troubling her since the morning's discovery. I was facing away from the entrance, focused on Gerald's reaction rather than its cause. By the time I turned to look, several people had entered, other hotel guests arriving for dinner. Yet Monsieur Pemberton's recognition was immediate and specific, someone whose presence transformed his entire evening from pleasant dinner conversation to nervous anticipation. He kept checking his watch after that, she admitted, and when he mentioned his 11:30 appointment, there was something almost triumphant in his manner, as though seeing this person had confirmed something he'd long suspected. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. The psychology of our killer becomes clearer, mademoiselle. We seek someone who has been playing a very long game, someone who has carefully maintained a respectable facade while orchestrating events from the shadows, someone whose presence at the Metropole was no coincidence. As Miss Ashworth departed, her face pale with the implications of their conversation, Poirot reflected on the psychological trap he was carefully constructing. The killer had demonstrated remarkable intellectual arrogance in the staging of Pemberton's death, unable to resist leaving their signature upon the crime. That same arrogance would prove to be their downfall. The psychological game was entering its most crucial phase, and Poirot's little grey cells hummed with anticipation as the final pieces of the puzzle began to align. The afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked windows of the blue drawing-room cast shifting shadows across the assembled company, creating an atmosphere of theatrical tension that seemed entirely appropriate for the drama unfolding within the Grand Hotel Metropole's elegant walls. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his compact figure commanding attention through the sheer force of intellectual authority rather than physical presence. Inspector Morrison entered carrying a telegram that had arrived from Scotland Yard, his expression grave with new understanding. "Mr. Poirot, we've received additional information about the Bath Street Consortium that changes everything. The fraud was far more sophisticated than we initially suspected." "Ah." Poirot's eyebrows rose with keen interest. "And what form did this sophistication take, Inspector?" "The Consortium's success depended entirely upon fraudulent archaeological assessments," Morrison explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Someone with impeccable academic credentials provided false historical reports claiming certain properties contained archaeologically significant remains. These fabricated assessments artificially inflated land values before the Consortium's deliberate collapse. The effect upon the assembled suspects was immediate and telling. Professor Kellerton's pen stopped moving across his notepad, while Miss Vance's usual efficient note-taking faltered noticeably. Mr. Whitfield's face grew pale, and Miss Ashworth leaned forward with evident fascination. Lady Pembroke pressed her handkerchief to her lips with trembling fingers. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, his keen eyes cataloguing each reaction with scientific precision. "Academic credentials, properly employed, make such excellent camouflage for criminal enterprise. Who would question the word of a distinguished professor regarding historical significance?" Professor Kellerton cleared his throat nervously. "Surely you cannot suggest that legitimate academic research could be corrupted in such a manner. The peer review process, institutional oversight—" "Ah, but Professor," Poirot interrupted gently, "we speak not of legitimate research, but of its deliberate perversion. Consider the psychology required for such deception, the ability to maintain scholarly respectability while orchestrating systematic fraud. Such a mind would possess both intellectual arrogance and meticulous attention to detail." Miss Vance's notebook trembled slightly in her hands as she resumed her careful documentation, but her professional composure remained intact. "The professor's reputation is beyond reproach, Mr. Poirot. His expertise in economic history has been invaluable to Mr. Pemberton's investigation." "Indeed, mademoiselle, and that expertise has shaped our entire understanding of this case, has it not? The historical parallels, the complex financial structures, the academic framework within which we have been encouraged to view these events, all provided with scholarly authority. Poirot moved closer to the center of the room, his voice dropping to an intimate tone that compelled attention. But let us consider what Monsieur Pemberton discovered yesterday evening that so dramatically altered his demeanor during dinner. Miss Ashworth described his shock upon seeing someone enter the dining room, someone whose presence confirmed his worst suspicions. The recognition was immediate and specific, he continued, his gaze moving methodically from face to face. Our victim realized that his trusted academic consultant was not merely an expert observer of historical fraud patterns, but the architect of a contemporary version of those same crimes. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Each suspect seemed frozen in place, afraid that the slightest movement might draw Poirot's devastating attention. The killer arranged to meet Monsieur Pemberton at 11:30, promising to provide the final documentary evidence he desperately sought. But instead of documents, they brought death, administered with the same methodical precision they had applied to their academic deceptions. Mr. Whitfield found his voice, though it emerged strained and defensive. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Poirot. Surely you require more than psychological speculation." "On the contrary, monsieur, I require only the evidence of character. Our murderer could not resist leaving their intellectual signature upon the crime. The precise arrangement of the body, the measured water level, the theatrical staging that speaks of a mind obsessed with imposing academic order, even upon death itself." Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a chess master approaching the endgame. "The psychological trap is nearly complete, mes amis. Our killer has demonstrated remarkable intellectual vanity throughout this investigation, carefully directing our attention toward false solutions while maintaining their scholarly facade. But such arrogance invariably becomes its own downfall." The room held its breath as Poirot prepared for the final phase of his psychological campaign, knowing that the killer's own need for intellectual superiority would soon compel them to reveal the brilliant, methodical mind that had orchestrated Gerald Pemberton's death with such chilling precision. The psychological pressure that Poirot had been methodically constructing reached its crescendo with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The silence in the blue drawing room had transformed from mere tension into something almost palpable. The collective held breath of minds, awaiting revelation. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, but within these elegant walls, the storm was about to break with devastating force. "We have established," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "that our murderer possesses a mind of exceptional intelligence, one that values order and precision above all else. Someone who has orchestrated not merely a crime, but an entire symphony of deception spanning months, perhaps years." His keen eyes moved methodically across each face, noting the subtle shifts in expression, the involuntary tells that betrayed inner turmoil. "This person has demonstrated remarkable psychological sophistication, the ability to manipulate not only financial systems and academic credentials, but human nature itself." Professor Kellerton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his chalk-stained fingers drumming nervously against his notepad. "Mr. Poirot, surely these theoretical discussions—" "Are far from theoretical, Professor," Poirot interrupted gently. "For you see, our killer has been present throughout this investigation, carefully observing our progress, subtly guiding our conclusions, ensuring that we focused our attention precisely where they wished it directed." Miss Vance, seated slightly behind the professor as always, maintained her professional composure, but Poirot observed the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip on her leather notebook. The Bath Street Consortium fraud required someone with intimate knowledge of academic protocols, access to scholarly credentials, and the practical ability to execute complex financial manipulations. Poirot continued. But most importantly, it required someone invisible, someone whose intelligence and capabilities were systematically overlooked by a world that refused to see brilliance in unexpected forms. The effect was immediate and telling. Miss Vance's carefully maintained facade flickered, just for an instant, but long enough for Poirot's trained eye to catch the flash of recognition and defiance that crossed her features. "For 15 years, Poirot said, his voice dropping to an intimate tone. Mademoiselle Vance has been the true architect of Professor Kellerton's scholarly reputation. She has written his papers, conducted his research, managed his correspondence, while he received acclaim for brilliance that was never his own." Professor Kellerton turned toward his secretary with genuine bewilderment. "Eleanor, what is he suggesting? This is preposterous." "Is it, Professor?" Miss Vance spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice carrying an authority that had been carefully concealed beneath decades of professional subservience. "Tell me, can you even remember the last time you wrote an original thought without my guidance?" The transformation was startling. Gone was the self-effacing secretary who had hidden behind her notebook. In her place stood a woman of formidable intelligence whose eyes blazed with the fury of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally crumbled beyond repair. The fraudulent archaeological assessments that inflated the Consortium's property values, Poirot continued, were your work, mademoiselle. You created the complex network of shell companies and charitable trusts, using Professor Kellerton's credentials as your shield, while orchestrating the systematic theft of investor funds. Miss Vance rose from her chair with sudden decisiveness. You understand at least that much, Mr. Poirot. Yes, I designed every aspect of what Gerald Pemberton so dramatically called his modern echo of the South Sea bubble. But it was more than mere theft. It was an intellectual exercise, a demonstration that I could manipulate an entire system without anyone suspecting the true source of their orchestration. And when Monsieur Pemberton grew too close to the truth, Morrison pressed. Gerald was more perceptive than I anticipated, she admitted with grudging respect. When he requested the professor's consultation, I saw an opportunity to observe his investigation closely, to guide his research toward conclusions that would protect my interests. But yesterday evening during dinner, he made a connection I had not foreseen. The moment his demeanor changed so dramatically, Poirot observed, he realized that his trusted academic consultant was not merely an expert observer of historical fraud, but the contemporary perpetrator he sought. Miss Vance nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose intellectual prowess was finally receiving proper recognition. He confronted me after the others retired, demanding evidence to prove his theory. I agreed to meet him at 11:30, promising to provide the documents he sought. Instead, I brought digitalis, extracted from foxglove plants in my cottage garden. The staging of his death, Poirot said quietly, the precise arrangement in the bathtub, the measured water level. My signature, she replied with evident pride. I could not resist demonstrating that even in death, Gerald Pemberton would be subject to my intellectual authority. The crystal paperweight, moved from his desk where it had pinned his accusatory notes, served as my final commentary on his presumptuous investigation. The confession was complete, the psychological trap sprung with devastating efficiency. Miss Eleanor Vance, the invisible woman whose brilliance had been overlooked and undervalued for decades, had finally received the recognition she craved as one of the most coldly calculating murderers Poirot had ever encountered. The confession hung in the air like the scent of poison itself, transforming the elegant drawing room into a theater of revelation. Miss Vance stood with newfound dignity, her shoulders squared as she finally claimed the recognition that had eluded her for decades. The digitalis was extracted from foxglove in my cottage garden, she continued, her voice carrying the measured tone of a lecturer addressing her pupils. I had studied its historical applications extensively. Another research project attributed to the professor, naturally. The dosage required precise calculation to ensure Gerald would remain conscious long enough for proper staging. Professor Kellerton's face had gone ashen, his hands trembling as the full scope of his secretary's deception became clear. Eleanor, all these years, how could I not have known? Because you never truly looked, she replied with devastating calm. For 15 years, I wrote your papers, conducted your research, managed your correspondence. You signed your name to my thoughts and received a claim for brilliance that was never yours. The Bath Street Consortium was simply my final, most elaborate demonstration of capabilities you refused to acknowledge. Morrison stepped forward, his notebook forgotten in the face of such methodical confession. You lured Pemberton with false promises of evidence. I promised him documentary proof of the Consortium's fraudulent assessments, my own work, ironically. When he arrived at 11:30, eager as a schoolboy with his theories, I prepared coffee while he examined the forged papers I had created to maintain his interest. The digitalis was already dissolved in the sugar I carried. And the staging afterward? Poirot inquired, his keen eyes noting every detail of her psychological unraveling. Miss Vance's lips curved in a smile of genuine pride. Gerald grew dizzy within minutes, complaining of blurred vision. As the poison took effect, he became pliable, easily guided to the bathroom where I had already drawn 6 inches of water, measured precisely for the effect I desired. I arranged his hands, closed his eyes, positioned him as though he had simply chosen to rest. The crystal paperweight was my signature. He had used it to pin his accusatory notes, so I thought it appropriate that it should witness his final scene. You could not resist leaving your intellectual mark, Poirot observed. Even in murder, you imposed academic precision. Exactly. Her eyes blazed with the fire of recognition finally achieved. Gerald discovered yesterday evening that his trusted academic consultant was not merely an expert observer of historical fraud, but the contemporary architect he sought. When he confronted me before our meeting, he actually laughed, at what he called the invisible woman behind the great man. He spoke of using my story as a moral lesson for his readers, reducing my masterpiece to newspaper sensationalism. The psychological portrait was complete now, and Poirot nodded with the satisfaction of a puzzle perfectly solved. You killed not merely to protect your criminal enterprise, but to prevent the final insult, that your brilliance would be recognized only as evidence in a trial. Precisely, she replied, extending her wrists as Morrison approached with handcuffs. Though I find there is considerable satisfaction in being remembered as the architect of one of the century's most sophisticated frauds, rather than as someone's invisible secretary. As the police led her away, her head held high with defiant pride, the remaining suspects sat in stunned silence. Professor Kellerton buried his face in his hands, finally comprehending the extent of his unwitting complicity. Miss Ashworth watched with the fascinated horror of a journalist recognizing a story of unprecedented depth. A remarkable case, Morrison said quietly as the door closed behind the prisoner. To think she orchestrated everything, the fraud, the murder, even our investigation, while appearing to be nothing more than an efficient secretary. Poirot moved to the window, watching the police car disappear into the London evening. The rain had stopped, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. The psychology of the overlooked genius, Inspector, he mused, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. Perhaps the most dangerous criminal mind of all, one that believes the world owes it recognition and will stop at nothing to claim that acknowledgement, even through infamy rather than honor. He turned from the window, his expression grave yet satisfied. Monsieur Pemberton died pursuing truth, and truth he found, though it cost him his life. Miss Vance possessed the intellectual capacity for greatness through legitimate means, yet chose instead to demonstrate her superiority through elaborate deception and ultimately murder. As they prepared to leave the Grand Hotel Metropole, Poirot reflected that justice, like a well-balanced equation, required precision above all else. The elegant halls would long remember the autumn evening when brilliance and evil had walked hand in hand, hidden behind professional invisibility until his little gray cells had finally illuminated the darkness with the cold, clear light of truth. With that philosophical observation, Hercule Poirot stepped into the corridor, his footsteps precise and unhurried, leaving behind the echo of deception and the lingering scent of justice finally served.